Once again, let's take a trip back to 1969, and this time, we're looking at the albums that hit the shelves in August, the very same month that hundreds of thousands of people gathered for the legendary Woodstock Festival. So without further ado, let's begin.
It's 1969, okay. Walk across the USA.
While Woodstock celebrated the optimism of the late 60s, the debut album by the Stooges offered the complete opposite, a primal aggressive sound and a nihilistic attitude that foreshadowed the punk movement of the following decade.
It's another year for me and you. Another year with nothing to do.
The record was produced by John Cale of the Velvet Underground, and it sounded unlike anything else released in 1969. At a time when many bands were experimenting with elaborate production and more ambitious musical approaches, Iggy Pop and company stripped rock and roll back to its basics. And Ron Asheton's guitar tone on this album remains one of my favorite guitar tones of all time. I just can't never get enough of that gloriously filthy guitar sound.
Now I wanna be your dog. Now I wanna be your dog. No fun for my babe. No fun. I said we will have a real cool time tonight. She wants something. She wants something. All right.
The influence of John Cale was particularly noticeable on the song We Will Fall, which was the longest and most hypnotic track on the album.
Goodbye.
The album was both a commercial and critical failure upon its release. It peaked at just number 106 on the Billboard chart and was dismissed by many critics. Rolling Stone described it as loud, boring, tasteless, unimaginative, and childish, while Robert Christgau from The Village Voice described it as stupid rock at its best. Over the decades, however, its reputation has been completely transformed, and nowadays the Stooges' first album is rightfully regarded as one of the most influential rock albums ever made, influencing generations of bands across a wide range of genres. One of the bands that benefited the most from their appearance at the Woodstock Festival was Santana. The band's performance at the festival helped launch them into the spotlight almost overnight, introducing them to a massive audience just a couple of weeks before the release of their debut album in late August 1969. The self-titled debut album by Santana introduced the world to a unique blend of rock, blues, and Latin rhythms, driven by Carlos Santana's distinctive guitar playing and the band's use of percussion. And the album captured the live improvisational energy that had impressed audiences at Woodstock and featured some of Santana's most memorable songs. The record went on to become a major success, reaching the top 5 on the Billboard 200 and establishing Santana as one of the most distinctive new bands of the late 60s. August 1969 also saw the release of the first and only album by Blind Faith, one of the first major supergroups in rock music. Even before releasing any music, the band had already attracted a great deal of attention, and they officially debuted on the 7th of June with a free concert in Hyde Park that attracted an estimated 100,000 fans, creating enormous expectations for their first album. The album immediately generated controversy because of its original cover, which was quickly replaced with an alternative photo of the group. From a musical point of view, the album showcased a relaxed and melodic mix of rock, blues, and soul, moving away from the heavier sound associated with Cream. With so much talent involved, expectations for the group were extremely high before they had even released any music. And when the record was finally released, many critics felt that it didn't quite live up to the expectations. From a commercial standpoint, however, the album was a huge success, reaching number 1 on the album charts in the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada, and eventually achieving platinum status. But the pressure surrounding the supergroup and the band's internal tensions led to their breakup less than a year after forming. Personally speaking, even though I like the album, I've always found it a bit underwhelming and somewhat uninspired at times. But of course, that's just my opinion.
When they say I wrote that beat to the floor.
The same month that Eric Clapton and Ginger Baker returned with Blind Faith, their former Cream bandmate Jack Bruce began a new chapter in his career with the release of his first solo album, Songs for a Tailor.
It's hang girls and young men on the ropes of Tweety Mines.
I've always felt that this record was much stronger than the album by Blind Faith. In fact, I consider this to be one of the greatest and most remarkable albums of 1969. And I honestly think it stands alongside the best albums Cream ever released. That's how much I love this album.
I bought you ticket for the waterfall, and you poured away on the chain.
The album showcased Jack Bruce exploring a wider range of styles and musical influences, and it was more musically diverse than his previous work with Cream. On top of that, it featured a truly stunning lineup of musicians, including Chris Spedding on guitar, and Coliseum members Dick Hextall-Smith on saxophone and John Heisman on drums. The album is excellent all the way through, and one of its most memorable songs is Theme from an Imaginary Western, which was later covered by bands like Coliseum and Mountain. The record received generally positive reviews from the British press and enjoyed great success in Britain, where it reached number 6 on the album charts. In America, however, the album was mostly panned by critics, with Rolling Stone describing it as disappointing, and the record peaked at number 55 on the Billboard charts. Songs for a Tailor remains, in my opinion, one of the most impressive solo albums by a former member of Cream. It showed that Jack Bruce was not just a great bassist and vocalist, but also a brilliant songwriter capable of creating music that went far beyond the boundaries of his former band.
I feel so good, that you never want to come.
Another notable release from August 1969 was On Time, the debut album by Grand Funk Railroad. The group was formed in Michigan, and even before the release of their first album, they had already gained attention for their powerful live performances. The record was produced by Terry Knight, and it offered a very unique blend of early heavy rock mixed with clear influences of soul music, with Mark Farner's aggressive guitar playing and vocals being perfectly complemented by Mel Shacker's heavy bass sound and Don Brewer's energetic drumming.
You ain't gonna find nobody to treat you like I do.
Grand Funk Railroad were always hated by critics who described their music as dumb rock, and certainly the band were never known for their lyrical sophistication, and they often had a sort of Spinal Tap quality about them, if you know what I mean. But their first 2 albums are excellent. They burst from the speakers with raw energy and a truly exciting sound that mixed early heavy rock with elements of the gritty soul music that came out of their native Detroit. And unlike many heavy bands from that period, Grand Funk's rhythm section knew how to groove, and that's one of the highlights of those first 2 albums. On Time was not an immediate commercial success, but it eventually went gold after the success of their following releases. Grand Funk Railroad would later move towards a more polished and accessible brand of hard rock, and they would eventually become one of America's biggest bands of the 70s. But I think their first 2 albums deserve way more recognition than they usually get. Another fascinating release from August 1969 was Soft Machine's second album, Volume 2. By this point, bassist Kevin Ayers had left the band and had been replaced by Hugh Hopper, whose arrival marked a significant change in the group's sound. Volume 2 was an adventurous blend of psychedelic rock, jazz, experimental music, and absurd humor. Rather than relying on conventional songs, the album was built around 2 long suites divided into shorter sections, and this was one of the earliest records to combine progressive rock with jazz in such a natural way. Volume 2 was never intended to be a commercial record, but it received positive reviews, with Melody Maker praising its originality and musicianship. The album didn't chart in Britain, but it seemed to have caused quite an impression in the Netherlands, where it reached number 2 on the album charts. But despite not charting in their native Britain, over the following decades, the album became recognized as one of the key early releases of the Canterbury scene, and an important stepping stone towards Soft Machine's later records. And speaking of vinyl records, if you're a record collector, you know that one of the things that can prevent your records from sounding their best is dirt and grime that builds up over time. But fortunately, that's no longer a problem with the new HumminGuru Nova. About a month ago, HumminGuru kindly sent me their new Nova Ultrasonic record cleaner to try out. It's a fully automatic ultrasonic cleaner that uses 40 kHz ultrasonic technology to provide a thorough and effective clean. I've used it on everything from lightly dusty records to some pretty dirty second-hand finds, and the results have been consistently impressive. Just to give you an example, I recently bought an original US pressing of the aforementioned second album by Soft Machine. The record was quite dirty and had a lot of surface noise, but after using the HumminGuru Nova, it really got a new lease of life. It sounded noticeably quieter, with less surface noise and fewer clicks caused by dust trapped in the grooves. If you're serious about collecting vinyl, and want an easy and effective way to keep your records in great condition, I definitely recommend the HumminGuru Nova. I'll leave a link to the product in the video description. And now on with the show. Barabajagal was the 7th studio album by Donovan. The album showed him continuing to expand his musical horizons by incorporating heavier rock influences into his sound. And one of the most interesting aspects of the album was Donovan's collaboration with the Jeff Beck Group, who appeared on the title track and on another song called Trudy. The lineup featured Jeff Beck on guitar, Ronnie Wood on bass, Nicky Hopkins on piano, and Tony Newman on drums. The album mixed psychedelic rock, folk, pop, and blues influences, featuring both experimental songs and more traditional Donovan compositions.
Do you have a shirt that you really love? One that you feel so groovy?
And it also included Atlantis, which became one of Donovan's biggest hits. The record was not as commercially successful as some of Donovan's earlier albums, but it remains a good LP that captured that late 60s moment when folk, psychedelia, and heavy rock were beginning to merge. And the involvement of the Jeff Beck Group also made it one of the more unique releases from the second half of 1969.
All right, let's keep it moving. Here's one that's climbing fast. It's Creedence Clearwater Revival with Green River. Turn it up. Take it back
Another great record from August 1969 was Green River, the 3rd studio album by Creedence Clearwater Revival and the 2nd of the band's 3 albums released that year. By this point, Creedence had already established themselves as one of the fastest-rising American rock bands, and Green River offered yet another strong collection of swampy rock tracks with a rootsy sound that contrasted with the more progressive approach that was beginning to emerge during that period. Even though the band had already enjoyed a few hit singles, Green River became their first album to reach number 1 on the Billboard chart. And the record also produced two of their biggest hits, with both Bad Moon Rising and Green River reaching number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. August 1969 also saw the release of Monster Movie, the debut album by the German band Can, one of the pioneering groups of the movement that would later become known as krautrock. The album received little attention when it was first released, but it marked the beginning of one of the most influential and adventurous careers in experimental rock. Monster Movie combined psychedelic rock with free jazz, improvisation, tape experimentation, and hypnotic rhythms. It was a sound that was very different from anything else released at the time. And this is also one of the few albums from the late 60s that already displayed the influence of the Velvet Underground, as evidenced by the album's opening track, which showed clear influences from Lou Reed and company.
Keep remembering, mother screaming, I am mother, woman screaming, I am fertile, and the father, he hasn't been born yet, he hasn't been born.
Monster Movie laid the foundations for Can's groundbreaking career and for the development of krautrock as a whole. And just like some of the band's later releases, the album became a major influence on artists across several genres over the following decades. As Safe as Yesterday Is was the first album by Humble Pie, a band formed by former Small Faces frontman Steve Marriott and guitarist Peter Frampton, who had previously been a member of The Herd. And the lineup was completed by Jerry Shirley on drums and former Spooky Tooth member Greg Ridley on bass. Musically, Humble Pie's first album was an eclectic mix of blues rock, hard rock, folk, and psychedelic influences, showing that the group was more interested in exploring different musical directions than sticking to one particular style.
Before you ever heard the word, it's hard. Yes, your mother used to see her as a star.
Steve Marriott handled most of the songwriting, but Peter Frampton also made important contributions, giving the album a good balance between heavier rock numbers and more melodic material.
And it ain't too hard to see that your work for the dead don't you know the time back. Run to the nearest band. Color on this skin don't win. He ain't just like you. And your feel smells so sweet. A big green makes no pain.
The album reached number 32 on the UK album charts and received generally positive reviews from the British music press. The New Musical Express praised it as an album that would improve with repeated listens, while the Melody Maker felt the band had plenty of potential despite not offering anything particularly new. As a curious note, the album also became part of rock history when Rolling Stone critic Mike Saunders used the term heavy metal in a review of the record, reportedly one of the earliest published uses of the expression to describe a style of music. Overall, As Safe as Yesterday Is not usually regarded as one of Humble Pie's strongest albums, but I think it's a very good record that hinted at the direction the band would take on their later albums from the 70s. August 1969 also saw the release of For Sale, the fourth studio album by Love. Following a masterpiece like Forever Changes, one of the most acclaimed albums of the late 60s, Arthur Lee faced the difficult task of following up a record that had become the defining statement of the band's career. By this point, the original lineup had fallen apart, leaving Arthur Lee as the only remaining member, and he returned with a completely new group of musicians who gave the album a more direct and harder-edged direction than its predecessor.
Is all that I know. It's with me wherever I go.
Upon release, Forever Changes was not a commercial success in the United States, but the album received glowing reviews in the British press, where it was already being hailed as a masterpiece, and it even managed to enter the UK album charts, where it peaked at number 31. But because of the expectations created by Forever Changes, For Sale was always going to be a difficult album to follow. But still, the album got positive reviews in the press. The Melody Maker wrote,
First album for 2 years from Love, possibly the finest of all the groups to emerge from the West Coast rock revolution. Only Arthur Lee remains of the original group, but brilliance shines through, and most of the tracks are well up to the standard of their earlier classic albums. The guitar solos are blessed with that unique love quality of being both fast and lyrical. Some of the subtle beauty of Forever Changes is missing, but there is a greater range of styles. The best track is The Shattering August.
For Sale did not receive the same level of recognition as Forever Changes, but its reputation has grown over the years. I think the album was unfairly judged because it was compared to a masterpiece that was almost impossible to follow. But For Sale is still a very strong album that captured Arthur Lee reinventing love and moving the band in a new direction. Just like the aforementioned Santana, another band who greatly benefited from their appearance at the Woodstock Festival was 10 years after. Their legendary performance, especially Alvin Lee's explosive guitar playing, introduced the band to a massive audience and helped turn them into international stars. And the release of their fourth album in August came at the perfect time, coinciding with their appearance at the festival that same month.
Keep on praying, just have a flash since you hear what I'm saying all the time. Where she stomp around a while, shake on.
The band's Woodstock appearance would define their career in the eyes of many listeners. And this album remains an important record because it captured 10 years after at the exact moment when they were transitioning from respected blues rock musicians into international stars.
This year, the judges of the Cannes Film Festival presented the award Best Film by a New Director to Easy Rider. It's the story of a man who went looking for America and couldn't find it anywhere.
Another important release from August 1969 was the soundtrack album to the groundbreaking counterculture film Easy Rider. The soundtrack featured some of the biggest names in rock music at the time, including Steppenwolf, The Byrds, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, The Band, and the Electric Prunes, among others. And songs like Born to Be Wild and The Weight became closely associated with the film and helped define the sound of the era. Unfortunately, I can't play excerpts from the songs due to copyright restrictions, but I'm sure you're already familiar with most of the tracks. What made Easy Rider especially important was the way it changed the relationship between rock music and movies. Instead of using a traditional film score, the soundtrack relied on contemporary rock songs to reflect the mood and atmosphere of the story, which helped establish the idea that popular music could be a central part of a film's identity. Commercially, the soundtrack was a huge success, reaching number 6 on the Billboard charts and eventually achieving gold status. Easy Rider became one of the most influential rock soundtracks ever released, and it's a brilliant time capsule of the late 60s counterculture. I hope you enjoyed this trip back to August 1969. See you next time.